Our first speaker today is Dr. J.J. Hurtak and his wife, Desiree Hurtak. I've known them for many years also. All these speakers I know because I've been doing this forever. Okay, and he has the Academy for Future Science. And he's written 20 books, and there are many languages all over the world. And he is most, I think what I know him most for is he wrote The Keys of Enoch, if you've heard of that book. That's the main one I know you for, but I know you have a lot of other books that have a great deal of information in them. But so he's going to focus today on life throughout the universe. So let's welcome Dr. Hurtak and Desiree Hurtak. Okay. Okay. I have that?
Yes. No, he has that one. I have this one.
You got the lapel. Okay.
Thank you very much, beloved Dolores. And a few ground rules. Turn off your cell phones. This is being officially videotaped, so please no unnecessary film or flash photography regarding several of the subjects. And keep in mind that even though we're going to try to compress a lot of information, this is an ongoing teaching. So you're all involved with what I will call the Cosmic University.
Right, and so instead of talking about one particular sighting or experience, we're talking about really a whole cosmology. That's part of our work. From the experience Dr. Hurtak had in 1973, he was shown things about this planet past, present, and future, and we'll be talking about how that fits into the events that are taking place today.
So without further ado, I want to again thank Dolores and all members of this exceptional Congress.
Okay, we can give her a hand.
Our title is Exobiology, Explaining Life Throughout the Universe. That is to say, looking at life beyond Mother Earth, but also connecting it with all of the disciplines, such as archaeology. We know a lot about archaeology at this conference, anthropology, linguistics, remote viewing, remote sensing, the whole cosmology. This is the work of future science, which is science guided by consciousness. And so we look at what we're doing with the Mars program, such as the Mars Science Lab. We were privileged to be in Pasadena with Charles Alachi, president of Jet Propulsion Lab, when the rover Curiosity came down last August. We are founding members of the Mars Society, and we have had the privilege of working with many of the astronauts and several of the Russian cosmonauts in our recent time of looking at the larger cosmic roadmap of where we're going with all of this information.
What just came out from the Mars Curiosity rover, some of you may have seen it, is this picture of infrared imaging from their cameras. And what it showed them was that Mars had been a habitable planet. And all the colors that some of you can see in there shows some aspects of hydration of minerals. That means that water had touched upon these rocks at some point in the history of Mars. Now, what's really sad, though, is that many of you, if you followed the Curiosity rover and the probe going, the Mars Science Lab, is that they told us that what they were really looking for was to actually find evidence of life. And in a sense, they've bowed out, because we know governments tend to bow out. We were optimistic about NASA at this point, but they bowed out and said, well, we've fulfilled our goal, which is to see that Mars had or could have been habitable in the distant past. They are not pursuing in full force, at least not telling the public, to find out if microbacteria exists there or had existed in the past. They are now just claiming they have found what they were looking for, and that is that it could have been a habitable planet in the past. And so
we have to read between the lines of what officialdom is saying and what is going on behind the scenes. And we see here with the ExoMars program for 2016, the lander will dig down some 2 meters for life or microfossil intelligence. This is all good information, but it really does not get to the heart of matter.
But we're optimistic now on the next lander, and this is from ESA, which is the European Space Agency, and Russia. So they're teaming up to claim that they are actually going to look for life, microbial life, of course, but life on Mars. And what's interesting is the Russians, when we had connected with them even back in the late 80s, having traveled to Russia and also worked with some Russian scientists at the time, they believe that, even back then, that Mars either was habitable in terms of having microorganisms or had been habitable. So they were much more aware and open to talking about this than what any U.S. NASA scientist was ever willing to say. So we're really now optimistic, sadly, about a European and Russian probe instead of the NASA probe. Maybe NASA will come out and say something prior to, knowing that they would be outscooped.
This is only a small part of a much larger story. In 1973, I had this exceptional experience of having the direct contact with light. I call the Merkaba experience. This word has gone out into the popular literature of not contact with extraterrestrial, but with ultra-terrestrial intelligence. I was taken literally into a higher dimensional reality and shown that there were pyramidal grids on our sister planet Mars. In fact, I gave information to NASA authority, and later when pictures were taken, I received permission to publish this in the Keys of Enoch. You see here these massive gargantuan pyramids in the Elysium Quadrangle, showing a, should we say, uniqueness, tetrahedral features. Mathematical proportions are very important here. Jacques Monod, the Nobel Prize winner from France, and Mother Nature doesn't replicate through clear standing angles or repetitive structures. But here we have, as it were, a signature of something that is very, very profound. Gargantuan structures, hundreds of times larger than the pyramids in Mexico and Egypt on the surface of Mars. These are objects that the Soviets were interested in looking at. What happened is, when their Phobos 2 mission got too close in orbital insertion, a strange vehicle that we see here on the screen suddenly appeared, and the billion-dollar Phobos 2 mission was neutralized. Not only was the Russian mission, but some 30-plus experiments of the European nations. Now, I had the opportunity to acquire the original film footage of this experience, and the shadow realities that hover above the satellite surface do not match the details of the satellite or the Martian surface, suggesting that, shall we say, a cosmic intelligence interfered with this mission. The suspicion is that the Russians had what we call dual-use technologies that could be used for planetary surveillance, but also used for military purposes. In any event, the Russians that I talked to behind the scenes said clearly this was an extraterrestrial event, and Marina Popovich, perhaps the most decorated female in the Soviet Union, went on public television stating that that was also her opinion, that there were other life forces in the universe that were preventing the probes that they were making going to Mars, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2.
So this was the very last image that Phobos 2, before it went dead, took and recorded and sent back to Earth. And most of the Russian scientists do feel it was intercepted by an alien spacecraft. And of course, we know, many of you have already seen this picture from the Allen Hills meteorite that came, they believe, because they tested the ingredients inside the meteorite, and they say, hey, that's the same atmosphere of Mars. They think that there might have been a large explosion on Mars that then landed or came here in terms of a meteorite, landed around the Antarctic, where many of these can be picked up easily. And when the scientists themselves looked inside, they saw this interesting formation, which they believe was a fossil of ancient bacteria. They came out with it. Many other people said, oh no, it probably isn't. But if you talk to the scientists themselves, they're still saying, yes, this was really from some sort of life form, not just chemical relationship that created this unusual structure inside the meteorite that came from Mars.
We know from recent information posted by the Goddard Spaceflight team that meteorites that have been examined show, again, the basic building blocks. And this has prompted many in the pioneering generation of the space program to come out of the closet. Astronaut Mitchell, we see here, in July 2008, released information on his interpretation of ET events at Roswell, he being from that area. But more importantly, in the year 2011, in a documentary he did, he admitted that there were extraterrestrial races. In other words, what I'm emphasizing in exobiology is that we're dealing with a much larger picture than microfossils. So what does this mean, Desiree?
Well, it means some of you may have seen the recent release that I think CNN even picked up on, that when the FBI released many of its secret files, the most popular file that people didn't go to Dillinger and all these other kind of interesting things that the FBI had investigated, the most popular file was this particular document that the FBI released, which is an office memo on UFO and specifically on the Roswell incident. And I'm just going to read it very slowly here. It says, an investigator for the Air Force stated, and this is in the FBI files, that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. They were described as being circular in shape with raised clusters, tops, approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of a shape that was also of 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits used by flying saucer or by currently speeding flight testers and test pilots. According to the informant, the saucers were found in New Mexico due to the fact, and this is very interesting, that the government has a very high-powered radar setup in that area, and it is believed the radar interference with the controlling mechanism, or interfere with the controlling mechanisms of the saucer. So this is back in 1950. I think everyone's worked that out now. The saucers are no longer interfered with our radar. We probably changed our radar, but that's actually the document in the FBI files that was released. So, and amazingly, people from all over the world are honing in on that particular office memorandum.
General Nathan Twining, a hero of World War II, wanted to release information, but he was countermanded, and later in other situations was then put into a situation of being in Alaska, really outside of the loop of the official disclosure projects. We have also the testimony of astronaut Gordon Cooper, who flew 22 orbits in his Mercury project, and he said that he flew higher and faster than anyone in history, but the real story is that he experienced extraterrestrial realities. In fact, we were able to cooperate with him on a document that was made into a novel entitled The Doomsday Conspiracy, the life story of a U.S. naval intelligence officer. He meets with a female extraterrestrial subject in Switzerland. Gordon Cooper addressed the United Nations with these words: I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets which are a little more technically advanced than we are on Earth. We may first have to show them that we have learned to resolve our problems by peaceful means rather than warfare before we are accepted as fully qualified universal team members. Their acceptance will have tremendous possibilities of advancing our world in all areas. Also, I did have occasion in 1951 to have 2 days of observation of many flights of them of different sizes flying in fighter formation, generally from west to east over Europe. They were at a higher altitude than we could reach with our jet fighters. What is missing here is a subject that he also emphasized in personal conversation, that he did not have the privilege of flying a UFO or meeting the crew of one, suggesting that there are those behind the scenes who are being entertained to fly vehicles that had already been retrieved, or at least being in a situation of knowing those who were connected with the cosmic others.
So if you put all this together, take a look at it. From the 1950s, FBI already had documented evidence about beings inside flying saucers that they had reports on from the Air Force. And then in 51, actually, and we did know Gordon Cooper, he saw when he was flying in these huge he was a test pilot, but he was also flying very high over the border of East and West Germany. And what he saw was a flotilla, not just one, a flotilla of spacecraft higher, he said, than he knew the top planes, higher than our Air Force could go at that time. And he said the Russians were looking at it too. He said, because they used to fly parallel. When they would fly on the border, with our jets, the Russians would also fly on their side with their jets, and then they saw these vehicles overhead. So he came back, he reported that. What did they do? Did they kick him out of the Air Force? No, they made him an astronaut. So why would you think if someone's crazy, you would ever make them an astronaut? They knew what was going on. They knew that actually, in a sense, that he was chosen for being able to go into the astronaut program because he could handle those type of things.
In the past, I was involved with remote sensing technology. I did private consulting. And here in one of the interesting documents we have from the files of Jet Propulsion Lab, we see our team on the moon. The two strange objects appear over the horizon of the moon. Actually, there's a third one you cannot see, forming a perfect triangulation. NASA later airbrushed this out so people would not be too suspicious as to who was really on the moon watching our astronauts there. But again, this begs a larger question that we are not alone in the universe. And yes, there are advanced technologies watching every one of our probes and every one of the Russian probes. And those with military technology, in my opinion, were neutralized because they were crossing the red line of bringing military technology too far without the proper protocols.
So what Dr. Hurtak's not saying about this is we know the guy, because he was a friend of ours, who was chosen by NASA to put together this American salute to the astronauts from a recap from 1969 to 79. And he had access to all the files. He found this. He put it on there. They didn't know what he was using. They just had given him access. And once the first publications had gone, they changed the cover. They wouldn't let him do it anymore. So it's very, very interesting of how these things work. But the other person who has seen things, and we also have talked to him, and in fact, Dr. Hurtak has written some papers on space law in connection with astronaut Buzz Aldrin. And although he doesn't like to talk about it very much, he has talked about his experience with seeing a light, him and Armstrong, when they were traveling in the first time that they were going to walk on the moon. They were followed by a light. So he's very, very familiar with those types of intelligence.
And affirmations by the pioneer team in space speaks volumes of what is behind the scenes. And in recent conversations with Buzz, we discussed, of course, a colony on Mars. We discussed the advantages of space law diplomacy, recognizing that outer space is the common property for all nations, and that we really need to break the umbilical cord with Mother Earth in the sense of having a diplomacy that will allow us to have our own sovereignty, perhaps even a space court on the International Space Station, so that turnaround decisions can be made more appropriately to the habitats that will be built on Mars, on the moon, as well as on space platforms.
So one of the things that Buzz, and you can see this on the internet, it was always amazed at, is this Phobos monolith. There's a reason why the Russians sent two probes, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2, to Phobos, not to the planet itself. This is back in the 80s. Neither of the probes made it, but there's this very unusual monolith. Plus, they said that the actual shape and the way the moon manages and rotates and functions seems to be that it was perhaps even an artificial type.
Singer, who was advisor to the Eisenhower administration, admitted he went into this subject because he was, shall we say, bemused somewhat by the statement of astrophysicist Joseph Shklovsky, who said he believed, the Russian scientist that is, that Phobos was an artificial satellite.
Right, and so basically, we don't think that you're going to find lots of people living and walking around on the Mars or on Phobos, which is its moon satellite, but you're going to find bases, or there are places of evidence of bases of extraterrestrials using these places for observation, perhaps now, of Earth.
So we're seeing something that brings to mind the movie 2001, with the finding of the monolith, these certain sound musical features. All of this possibly could be thought of in terms of a much larger orientation the film industry is going through to indirectly prepare a younger generation to accept these cosmic realities. Well, other realities were presented by this gentleman, Philip Corso, who was close to President Eisenhower, who wrote this amazing book called The Day After Roswell. Of course, he was assailed by Bud Hopkins and others who thought that the information was not kosher or correct. Nonetheless, he argues that there are several technical gifts that we were given by the cosmic others.
So one of those is this night viewing goggles. He said that when they got money to be able to develop it for the military, they took two technologies. They took a German infrared that they were using, and they took the technology that they got from Area 51 S4. And ultimately, of course, they came down from this to what we actually do have today. And this is what's over here is actually technology of today, where you could actually put these in your eyes. It's an electronic chip, like you have a contact lens, and you can actually see in the dark. So, and he believes, of course, more interesting is, and some of you should, if you're really UFO buffs and extraterrestrial people who look at this, that the aliens, the grays with the black eyes, you peel away the cover. They're almost like sunglasses, and you peel those away, and then you see their eyes behind it.
If you're UFO buffs, if you know they're there, you have a catalog of this. It's no longer a mystery. It's no longer a UFO. This is a buzzword that basically keeps information centered in the hands of the few. If you're working with the real cosmic frontier, you must also work with the reality that there are identified vehicles, there are identified categories of cosmic intelligence, and they are here on Earth as well as in space. This is not shocking. In fact, in 1995, at the first major disclosure conference in Washington, D.C., I was there with Jaime Maussan and Michael Hazelman and others. This document was presented from our field research in South America, an ant-like type being with wraparound eyes. Remember, Solomon tells us in the Old Testament, study the ant.
But what's really interesting is, why wear glasses like this if you're traveling all the time? I mean, just wear those kind of contact lenses that fit perfectly, and you're able to see in different light variations, which is very important. Of course, if they're living in space, lower light, they come to this planet, they need to be able to shield their eyes. They're not used to it.
What were some of the gifts?
Right. Another thing that Corso talked about, and many people who have investigated the Roswell Institute have also talked about, is the fact of the material. And now we have something called Bucky paper, named after Buckminster Fuller. They're carbon nanotubes. Where the technology came from, Corso would say would be from Area 51, and putting back into technology what they've discovered from alien spacecraft. But nonetheless, Florida State University and other places have come up with this very, very thin paper. You can see it up there. It looks like almost aluminum foil, but you can't, everything that they've always said, you can't tear it, you can't cut it. It's very, very strong. What's really interesting, and what our technology, our scientists may use it for, is to put it over aircraft, because it makes it almost impermeable to certain electromagnetic fields. So it's a perfect technology that one would use, and we may use it on some of our aircraft, especially the government Air Force, and it probably came from UFO technology. So I believe that Corso was right in many of the things he said. Maybe not every single thing came from Area 51, but I believe that perhaps this interesting paper.
Also carbon nanotubes, and this process is very important also for water purification. There's so many spin-offs, it's hard to go into all of them, but Corso was basically put down because he seemed to say too much too quickly. And yet we've seen that there are other realities behind the scenes that beg our attention, such as the work of Robert Ebenegger and others who suggest in this exhibit that there are these large nose beings that have a headdress very much like the ancient Egyptians.
Or Mayan-looking people.
And then they're holding a staff that seems to be either a type of voice computer system or a tubular system that's connected with using water in a type of interesting circuitry for possible reasons of energy, testing, or probes. Well, I was shown that the pyramids were chronomonitors. They were built on various planets, They were free energy sources. They were connected with water, hydraulics. If we go to the next exhibit, we had an opportunity to go to Egypt many years ago, and here we see some 33 meters below the sand surface of Giza, a series of one of the underground river systems, or I would just say canal systems feeding off the Nile River. There is a massive labyrinthian system, and if you look at the lower picture on the screen, you will see that there's a water moat on the side that we're testing sounds. We're looking at all of the features. Put it very simply, as you saw by the earlier speakers, going underneath the pyramids in Bosnia and Slovakia, we were able to go into the tunnels more extensively than anyone with the permission of the Egyptian authorities and document the fact that there was a whole underground grid system, what I would call a mini city underneath the Giza area that had its own economic reciprocity by the use of attracting energy through the pyramids and the use of water pumping stations.
Right, so we were actually the first to discover the Osiris Tomb. We found the lid. Hawass then dug out the rest of the tomb because that's... But this is part of that, and we believe from our research and with both remote sensing as well as sonar that there's actually more underneath the ground at Giza, and also from our physical being there, than there is above the ground. And so there's more and more to come out with. But it's interesting that there's also developments, of course, of finding these discoveries all over the world.
The question is, do you think that Egypt holds the secrets to the extraterrestrial probes that are over the Middle East? Do you feel that those documents that we know do exist could help bridge the gap in hostility between the various philosophies and religions in the area?
Well, part of our research has been to look back at some of the ancient Egyptian cosmology and also the structure of the pyramid itself. And you can see that there's a higher understanding of science, technology, and, as he said, sound frequencies that are able to activate. We've looked at a whole study of how the pyramid could be really an energy device.
We released in one of our new books dealing with the energy systems of ancient Egypt. So to answer the question I posed, we realized that Egypt really is the treasury of the ancient world. It was the library whereby the myths, the folklore were collected from various parts of the ancient Near East and North Africa, brought to Egypt, housed underneath in time capsules to be revealed at a future time. This is the future time. Now we know from our ET friends that Ben Rich had an interesting story to share with us in terms of their remarkable ability to travel.
Right, he was former head of the Skunk Works project at Lockheed. Lockheed works very closely with NASA and also with the military. A lot of the black budget is connected with what they call the Skunk Works. So he said, and he's unfortunately passed now, but so the Air Force has just given us a contract to take ET back home. He said that at a speech at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In addition, he was speaking to an associate right before he died, Jim Goodall, 1 week before he died, and he said,
Jim, we have things out there in the desert that are 50 years beyond what you can possibly comprehend. If you've seen it on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it was not worth the effort. So this is really quite a statement. And of course, we know many of the pioneers in the Star Trek series from Desilu Studios, and we have had the opportunity to know many of the people who claim to have been involved in the back engineering projects. But then again, this is all hypothetical. The question is, does this apply to the human race? Are we looking at an area only in one side of the planet, or are there many Area 51?
And of course, what Ben Rich was talking about when he said in the desert was Area 51. Everyone, I'm sure, knows about it. But let's look at the people who are coming forward from that area. That's what's really exciting, that it's not just Ben Rich talking about an area. It's not just things that the Air Force has released some time ago and got them off the ground just a little bit. And it's not even just what Robert Lazar came forward and talked about, even though he said a lot and people put him down. So now he's no longer interested in really talking much. What's interesting is note his badge. It says U.S. Department of Naval Intelligence. From our research, it was the Naval Intelligence, not necessarily the Air Force, that was doing a lot of this back engineering at Area 51. That's a very key statement to even just put that on a badge. It was naval intelligence.
It seems to be part of a controlled news release. Again, I use these words very carefully. A controlled news release means that higher authority allows certain individuals to come forth with super sensitive information, knowing that individual will be protected regardless of the social or political consequences. Well, Lazar speaks on various subjects. We have three here that are important. Project Galileo, which deals with gravity propulsion. Project Sidekick, which deals with energy beam weapons that have a neutron source focused by a gravity lens. That seems to contradict what I said earlier, that some forms of ET do not want certain weapon systems in space. And three, Project Looking Glass, looking back in time, something that does exist as a program, and one of the big corporations does have a program trying to look backwards in time, and there is some evidence to suggest that some ETs even gave some of our American engineers a device whereby they could go back and see even the event of the historic crucifixion of Christ, which you celebrated last week. So Western civilization seems to be based upon a cosmic timetable of events not only recorded in Egypt, but also by the various mythologies throughout the world, that every so many thousands of years, the world goes into a process of having to reintegrate itself with a new cosmology of consciousness, a new awareness of what ascension means, not simply looking at brass tacks or beautiful bullets. These realities, of course, speak of a much higher blueprint taking place.
Now, regarding Project Sidekick, we may be using it for weapons. To them, it could be just the energy beam that they're using for various technology movements. Now, another person that we've connected with, many people feel he's extremely controversial, is Dan Birch. And you see Dan here, actually Dr. Hurtak's on the far side, and this picture gets cut off, and Roger Lear. So we do feel that Dan had some encounter situation when he was in an area of Area 51 of the S4, where he actually saw, and as a microbiologist, took blood and samples from an alien being. We're going to get to that.
Feels that his knowledge of histology and microbiology is immaculate, and that he has put Dan through various tests, and Dan has come through with the right medical information. But again, this is a subject of great controversy. And again, I mentioned to all of the so-called whistleblowers, there's the upside and the downside.
We're going to take a minute and talk about Wendell Stevens, who was an old friend, and many of you know he passed away, but he probably really was some of the best, coming from a military background, investigator. And one of the greatest things he did right before he passed on, although his collection of extraterrestrial knowledge was incredible, if you've ever talked to Wendell, really appreciate him. He interviewed someone named Connor O'Ryan, a Area 51 security guard, and supposedly Connor is a pseudonym used by a man named Derek Hennessy. And Derek was working at various military jobs all his life, and the last assignment he had in 1991 was a 9-month stint at S4 facility. So he knew a lot of what was going on. His whole life had been military, and this was the last job he had. So he described the hangar facilities at S4 as having 7 flying saucers retrieved from various crash sites. They would go through the flight tests, except when the Russian spy satellites were passing overhead. They actually stopped all the testing. So they were actually watching, because they knew the Russians were watching. So not only are we watching Area 51, but the Russians are watching Area 51. He also described 7 tubes with bodies of extraterrestrial entities, EBEs, typically described as grays. A biologist would regularly check the fluids, and of course Dan Birch was one of those biologists at one time, to maintain the right temperature and fluid mix to maintain the bodies.
So some of you may recall back in the early 80s, there was an HBO movie starring Keenan Wynn. Keenan Wynn personified a remarkable character who is connected with bodies that were stored in a military morgue, basically a sub-area in canisters. And the thrust of the story is that the Native Americans help a young man who's a instrumentalist and his girlfriend use mental psychic ability. The film is called Wavelength. It's a very interesting film based upon one of my transcripts that mysteriously disappeared in Hollywood, only to reappear on screen. But I can assure you that there are those canisters, there are those specimens, and that we're looking at identified flying objects and entities, EBs, not UFOs.
But what was right, and so what Dan Birch also saw was not necessarily those in test tubes, but he actually saw live extraterrestrials. Now, the other person who saw a live extraterrestrial also working at Area 51S4. So there's 4 people. That's a lot. 4 people who have come forward and made public statements. This man also right now is no longer on the planet. He's deceased. Bill Uhouse. He was a flight simulator engineer from the 1950s to the 1970s from Area 51. And he said he had regular contact, not with necessarily someone in a clean room, which is what an extraterrestrial in a clean room, which is where Dan had seen them, where he would do tests and try to help them. Because if you've ever heard Dan's story, actually they are not that well. They were hoping that there could be some medical connection with us to help their ability to stay longer on the planet, so to speak, or longer in life. But Uhouse actually was working technologically with these J-rods. He's the one that called them J-rod, and he drew this picture of them.
Interesting that Edward Teller
supposedly came in with the J-rods.
Put a nice white shirt on the J-rod to make him personable to other engineers who were gathered in this think tank. He had an IQ that was basically, should we say, 2 to 3 times higher than most of our experts.
And supposedly the J-Rod would come in on meetings and he would teach, but very difficultly, our engineers back in the 70s how to use their technology. This is what Bill Uhouse showed. He said you had to ask a specific question and they would give you a specific answer. They would not just sit there and explain their technologies to you. And they would come in with meetings with Bill Teller, and Ed Teller. Okay. Ed Teller.
Hungary, he worked on the Manhattan Project. He was part of the inner team with the late John von Neumann and others who were really at the top of the American scientific community.
So Uhouse would say, these were all working together, giving them information at Area 51 on how to do the flight test.
This leads us to the Cosmic Cultures conference that took place in Washington, D.C., May 27th to 29th, 1995. This is a very important time when ex-members of the U.S. government, leading researchers in extraterrestrial science, were assembled. I had the opportunity to participate with Jaime Maussan, looking at the scientific documents that were formerly classified, media attention or inattention, the subject that would be brought out in popular literature. The heads of all major embassies were invited. None of them showed up. It was a subject that was perhaps too far off the roadmap at that particular time. Yes, John Mack was there, and we had an opportunity to share our work with the Zulus in Africa, and we had the opportunity to show that there were at least, at that time, 54, quote-unquote, alien races or categories, I prefer to use the word categories, of intelligence that we had inventory of.
And now you might watch that April 29th through May 3rd or 4th. Stephen Bassett from Exopolitics is going to be getting together on a citizens hearing. I know Linda Mullen Howe will be one of the speakers. We'll be in the audience as VIPs. But let's move on because there's so much to be said. I mean, the government has seen and continues to see extraterrestrials in space.
Connect the dots, and what do we see here with this particular dot, Desiree, in the STS?
Right. So STS is, all you buff should know, is really the space transport system. That was the space shuttle, and the 75th launch in 1996 saw this very unusual group of vehicles. I'm not going to show the video here. Many of you probably have already seen it. But what was interesting is we were setting off a tether. And that tether was connected with like electromagnetic radiation. It was supposed to be an antenna. And they were testing to see if they could gather energy from space. And for some reason, setting off the tether, we lost it. Literally, it just went away. So who knows how it got cut or how it got lost. But as it was going away, all these interesting, we'll say, beings or ships actually started surrounding the spacecraft, the tether.
Circular symmetry with one particular part of the outer rim marked. A very interesting film shows several different types of vehicles all connecting, not violating each other's space, but just overlapping, showing us a type of harmonious movements.
But we feel they are watching our technology very closely. They didn't want this antenna or tether out in space. They didn't want that type of technology. But there's others, of course, who think that the extraterrestrials are here for us, so to speak.
The question is, who's coming to dinner? We, part of the dinner, or the other side, in some ways show us something more than just the flesh and blood scenarios that have exemplified much of planetary history.
And of course, Edgar Mitchell has said many times that if they really wanted to do us in, they would have done it. So we believe, though, that there are different levels of intelligence, and some of them would do this if certain other levels of intelligence, we'll say, would let them. So we all have to, you have cattle mutilations, you have...
Explains why several governments until recent times have been reluctant to release information as to who's on first base, because there are many first bases. There are many ET cultures. In fact, there are so many that those in high authority do not know which scorecard to keep. And a basic scenario is also reflected in the writings of John the Divine in his book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, chapter 12, where he mentions this war in space, this confrontation between the angels of Michael and those forces that are cast down on the surface of Mother Earth. I believe this is the time of a cosmic house cleaning. And the keys of Enoch go into great detail with the various genetic tests, the areas of the pyramidal areas of the world that were time capsules of the genetic upgrades that took place in previous cycles, and also the scenarios of what would happen if we would simply bow down to extraterrestrials and not grow up for our own ascension, work with the ultra-terrestrials. So we have this big, shall we say, test coming as to who's coming to dinner. The wrong, or I would say the lower experimental team is coming first to do their medical homework. We have to be very cautious about this, and this is why in many of the sanctuaries in Central Asia, along the Silk Route, in many of the temples in the Near East, in Europe, you find, as we have here in the Viskoki Monastery in Yugoslavia, this depiction on the wall going back to the year approximately 1350 AD of two intelligences in a rivalry over Mother Earth.
Or at least watching what's going on. So what's interesting, of course, is that brings us back into what's important today, and that is the fact that even the Catholic Church has started to release information, and we believe they are releasing that information because they also know. We talked about the government knowing, but one of the biggest, we'll say, limits on this planet, and we go around to various countries of the world, is the religious base of what people believe and don't believe and how it fits their cosmology. And one of the things, of course, is the Catholic Church, one of the largest Christian denominations. And a few years back, Father Jose Funes, a Jesuit astronomer, said, as a multiplicity of creatures exist on Earth, so there could be other beings, also intelligent, created by God. This does not conflict with our faith because we cannot put limits on the creative freedom of God. Now, what's interesting, he was the main person at the Vatican Observatory. But what's also interesting is he's from Argentina. Who else is from Argentina that's Catholic? Anyone know? The Pope. Yes.
Do the major change that's been anticipated since the Council of Trent in the time of Martin Luther in the 16th century, namely to upgrade the cosmology. So this would be a great breakthrough. I know theologians of all major denominations as a participant in the Parliament of World Religions. Lutheran theologian Ted Peters believes that we need an exo-theology, a theology of beings off the planet, but the major thrust here is people need to understand there's a consciousness shift. And with that, there will be an understanding of higher scientific and spiritual knowledge coming closer together. This is a great opportunity really to understand that there is a dialectic between various forces for competition in control of human civilization.
Right. A good part of our work is to show that the religious philosophies, both of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and even Eastern philosophies, is in no way contradictory to an extraterrestrial base. In fact, one of our books, which we do have downstairs along with a few others, is the Pistis Sophia. And this is an ancient Egyptian Coptic text. This is ancient Christians. When the Christians, right after the time of Jesus' death, some of them went into Egypt and they became the Copts or the Coptics.
This is the lost teachings of Jesus according to the disciples of the disciples, showing various categories of stellar humans, the archangelic categories of those who we would call superintelligent or ultra-terrestrial, those that go into higher interdimensional realms of divine orders, and also the depiction that there are forces of testing or experimental gods, demigods that would like to see the human race destroyed, dead. With this Pistis Sophia teaching, which means in Greek the faith and the wisdom brought together, we'll acknowledge the three mysteries of the divine mind, the divine image, the divine specieshood, all being interconnected.
But they had a cosmology that they felt that there was a greater heavens, but then there's also the local heavens. And the local heavens had a lot of things going on that maybe weren't as kosher as that of the greater heavens. And that was their cosmology. So this is part of the philosophy that we work with, that there are local heavens of many extraterrestrial beings, some doing their own thing and some working together as a cosmic brotherhood.
Maybe we would call them multi-universes or the multiverse.
They've been here for a long time. Of course, this is a well-known picture, similar to what you find with Von Daniken, that the ancient, the Mayans and the Aztecs understood that they had some sort of contact with other beings. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. We'll see a few others as well. Also, what's very interesting is this elongated skull. You find pictures of it in Egypt. You find it in South America, especially in the areas around Ecuador. But you also find it in Austria. I mean, all over the world you find, so it's not one culture that was trying to elongate the skulls.
Anthropologist Klaus Dohn in 2000 had a very interesting assemblage of all of these special artifacts, some of them brought in by special guards to guard the glass cases that held artifacts of previous cycles of intelligence. But what was most important was a heel bone of a giant. And the heel bone was really the size of a normal hand, and this body was reconstructed later in Switzerland in plastic form, back engineered up to a height of some 28 to 30 feet in height. So there were giants literally that walked the earth. We're finding the bits and pieces. We're also looking at the underground sanctuaries in Mexico and South America, where not only pyramids exist on the surface, but there seems to have been areas of information storage in subsurface areas, such as the area of Teotihuacan with the Valley of the Dead. According to my experience, human civilization here is in a sleepwalk or a death consciousness. It is not really awakened to the reality of being a citizen of the universe. In this depiction made by an artist in Mexico, at one time, some form of energy was used, possibly from a crystalline source, to house and direct these vehicles as they made their entry into the earth. And we're connected with the Mayan and pre-Mayan people.
So, of course, Mexico will have Jaime Maussan, who is one of our oldest friends, this evening. We encourage everybody to be there and hear. I think he'll show the latest on St. Petersburg and some other fantastic things. One of the things he helped to release was, of course, this from Campeche. I'm going to just show a short part of it. Our time is getting shorter and shorter. This was seen not by the naked eye. We can just turn the volume down a little bit. This was not seen by the naked eye, but by LiDAR, radar. So this is what the airplanes that monitor drug running, literally, around the area of the Gulf of Mexico were seeing. And they were asked to count how many were there. And they were just shocked with what they were seeing. They do this all the time. People were saying it was this, it was that. These guys fly like every day. They fly over the same areas. They know what's there. They know what's not there. So let's take a look for a minute. They're gonna start counting how many vehicles were present here.
¿Qué es eso? A ver, trata de enfocar.
Máximo.
Ok, no dejes que lo dejes atrás. Ok.
Van.
Sigue ese, no lo dejes,
No, van todos, van aproximadamente como 10.
They have the exact.
¿Lo
Oh,
dio?
I think I'm losing it.
No.
They have the exact location. They have the exact time of day. It's all part of this. So in the long run, they themselves were counting how many. They thought there were 6, and then they said no, there were 7. There might have been 8. You can start seeing them coming through the clouds as a group.
A la misma altura.
Qué barbaridad, ¿eh?
Ahí se van a ver bien. Y van a una velocidad, pero 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
What's interesting is we're starting to see not just one vehicle. I appreciated the photo contest, but we're starting to see massive. If you count right there, you really see 8 vehicles coming across. Again, this is not with the naked eye. These pictures are not taken. There's even a 9th one. Sometimes they're going in threes. Now watch that. The fact that they're grouped into threes is also interesting. This is part of a way that they can fly. Some of them are 3, maybe 4. Just very, very interesting. We're going to move on to a few other pictures that are similar to this. Someone mentioned earlier Carlos Diaz. If you didn't know who that was, we're going to introduce you. And we're going to take about 5 or 10 minutes because I want you to hear his talk. And we're going to have the video a decent sound because what he tells you about his experience is amazing. This is the ships he saw. They're plasma ships.
Yes, and I did a small documentary on the plasma ships, but they represent a higher category. The keys of Enoch tell us, from the firmament the brotherhoods receive the whole light beings who come in the appearance of man with quantum mechanical corpuscles of light and move in the midst of humanity by gravitational flux line controls so that they who will see. The brotherhoods come and return in a flash of light. So what we're seeing here is something, again, much higher in scope than the ET technologies that crash into the planet that are the subject of retrieval by special military forces. The subjects of Carlos Diaz were taken to Italy and Germany, where photographic experts, those involved in image enhancement, looked at the interest in spherical movements, which you see here I'm pointing to with the laser, showing that these are not metallic constructed vehicles.
And of course, Jaime Maussan got very involved in this because if you've ever been to where Carlos Diaz lives, it's up in the mountains. It's Tepoztlan. It's actually a sacred area in Mexico. And he used to just take some photographs, and Jaime gave him his first video camera, so well, shoot the video, you know. And this is back in the 90s. It's not, you had cell phones and things like that at that time. So, but listen to what he says. We're going to have Dr. Hurtak's interview and then his interview. Listen to what he describes. It's very similar to what we heard yesterday about going into the caves and finding some very interesting artifacts inside caves in Mexico. So volume on the video.
What causes this strange luminosity? We still don't know. For Professor James Hurtak, the Carlos Diaz experience brings together the scientific and spiritual perspectives of the future and delivers a key to an interdimensional physics.
Carlos Diaz documents are very important because they show a different category of intelligence, what could be called the bioplasmic form of intelligence, that is even beyond the extraterrestrial, which is using metallurgical or physical spacecraft. Here we have seen by computer enhancements of the film actual realities, suggesting that this is a vehicle form that can change its shape, size, geometry in any number of ways. It comes close to what is called in the ancient documents of the prophets of the Western civilization, the Merkaba, or the vehicle of lights. In short, we are seeing in the Carlos Diaz material a whole new category of the UFO experience. We are going beyond the extraterrestrial into what could be called the ultra-terrestrial intelligence that is existing in a pure energy state. We are looking at a vehicle where there's no physical door, but has the opportunity to work with morphological energies that will open up a paraphysical door through which the contactee, in this case Carlos Diaz, will move into the vehicle. pass his physical hand through a body of energy. See no physical participants, but feel an omnidirectionality of energy. This case merits more study because it signals a graduation of ufology into another category, that of the ultra-terrestrial beings of intelligence, and will open a door to a whole new physics that will accept the possibility that there is a life so advanced that exists in a pure energy form, capable of manifesting itself through superluminal light without a physical form.
Is the Carlos Diaz ship of light an interdimensional gate? A projection from a parallel universe? An alien spacecraft? Why does it appear so frequently over the village of Tepoztlan? Is there any connection to the ancient cultures of Central America? Only the experience of a simple young man from Mexico might be the answer to all these questions.
The first time he invited me to go consciously into a ship, I saw my friend getting in first. He went through this fog-like light. When more than half of his body was inside of the light, his body got sucked into the object. So what I did first is that I put one hand into the light to feel, and to my surprise, it went through the light, and inside I felt a nice temperature. When I took my hand out, I was very relieved to see it was still in one piece. So that gave me the confidence to walk in, and when I had my body halfway inside the object, I was sucked into it too. But once you are into it, there is nothing you can see. You just see yellow light all over. You don't feel your toes, you don't feel the floor, but the sensation is very peculiar, because you feel very peaceful with a lot of love within you. Once, when I came out of the yellow light, I realized I was not at the same place, but I was in a big cave. It had stalactites and stalagmites, and between them I saw several sculptures and ornaments, which were of the art of the Maya culture. This big cave was the place where the ship hovered, and there was a kind of path we walked through, and we came to another cave, and I saw there many people who were very kind to me and greeted me, very nice people. But the particular thing about this cave was that there were 7 egg-like spheres of yellow light. After we got to this place, my friend stuck his hand into one of the eggs and took out a small bowl of light, also yellow, and said that this little bowl could project a ray that would touch my 7th vertebrae in the middle of the spine, and it would take all the information which is in my neurons. Once I was there in this place, he invited me to go into one of those spheres of light, or eggs of light. When I did so, I realized that all the yellow color changed, and it was not yellow anymore, but it was a scene of a forest from the air. It was like if I was flying, and then I saw on each of my sides a wing, the wing of an eagle, and I realized that what I was looking at was the information from an eagle, his memories that they had stored into this egg of light.
So you can...
We're going to stop at that point. What I was impressed with was the humility of Carlos Diaz. He had little furniture in his house, but there was a picture of the Virgin and the Christ. I was deeply touched by his deep spirituality, that he could see these beings. I have seen these beings. They are what traditionally we call the angelic, those that would glow with light. And what was very clear as we dialogued together is that the lower hierarchies that were mischievous were going to be displaced. They were the ones behind the war, the convulsions, many of the disruptions of quote-unquote human civilization. At the time of the return of the eagle from the north, the condor from the south, the upsurge in understanding the greater heritage of the indigenous people is so important because they are the wisdom keepers of the sacred places where the time capsules, the historic information is there connecting this civilization with those of the past and also with the avenue to the future.
Right. What Carlos was very concerned about, that he said the extraterrestrials, or ultra-terrestrials as we call them, that's ultra-terrestrials, UTs, were concerned about was the environment on planet Earth and what was taking place. So that might have been one of the reasons why they were capturing some of the essences, we'll say, or mind thought forms, and coding those into these yellow spheres. There might have been some connection with that. So what is happening on planet Earth, and why are ETs coming here now? Well, of course, they've been here for a long time, but they seem to be making their presence more and more known.
We see a decrease in the planetary magnetic field. Desiree and I have noticed this in South Africa. The runway numbers are being changed by the custodians. They realize major changes are at hand also in South America. There's an alleged increase in planetary-based resonance frequency that is being heard throughout the world.
The hums, the various vibrations connect even with pyramids, as we saw yesterday.
There are the effects of high energetic cosmic ray inundations coming from our sun.
And beyond, even center of the galaxy supposedly sends cosmic rays that affect our sun that may be causing more solar flares.
Also what is called the morphogenic field validation by those who work with Sheldrake and others. And my experience in 73 was going through a morphogenic door that opened through the lights. We have altered states of consciousness that are signaling that consciousness is the hidden variable for a new science, for quantum transitions and non-locality. And we have also the collective morphic resonance field that is there by those who practice what they preach. Namely, the daily prayers that you have and meditations are the key power of the higher ascendant process.
And all of us don't even realize it, but if you have cell phones and you're thinking of somebody and all of a sudden they call, they couldn't do that years ago. If they were out and driving their car, I think.
Well, beware of too much technology near your heart or your head.
A new battery here.
There's the process of the scientific slide towards technical self-destruction. And so this is so important to realize through remote viewing and remote sensing, you have those spiritual gifts. You do not need to rely upon technology.
Yeah. No, but what I was saying was that, now people, if you're thinking about them, can immediately call you. This is part of that collective morphic resonance. And it happens to many people. Rupert Sheldrake has done some of the research on this. And you really know, it's a question of whether you're projecting to them and they're calling you, or you're picking up on them because they are calling you. So you never know who started it first. But anyway, there's a lot going on the planet. We had some other friends as well who had direct contact.
There was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Klaar who in South Africa, in the area of Drakensberg, had this remarkable experience with a being called Miton, or Archon, as he is referred to, from the civilization of Miton. Here I'm pictured with her several years ago. She was examined by Russian as well as German scientists who believed her story of having mathematical text showing that parallel civilizations were interacting with the human race at key areas throughout the world.
Right. This is the person that she connected with from extraterrestrial place. She was actually taken to their planet, but had a child.
Where the planet resides is mentioned in the Keys of Enoch. So we have many confirmations taking place by other contactees throughout the world.
And she supposedly had a child that then remained in Miton. This is back in the 50s. This is not a new experience. Yeah. That she made. A few other.
Also, through our friend, the late Dr. John Mack from Harvard University, the opportunity to have worked with him in South Africa and Brazil. In 1996, of course, we know the famous event of Virginia in Minas Gerais. And of course, here are the illustrations and depictions in Astoria and other Brazilian reports and documents. You have this interesting being that has a triangulation on his back, in his neck.
Almost red eyes, small little horns on his head, and kind of smell, they said.
Captured by the local fire authorities. Linda Moltenhall has done a great analysis of this report. Had the opportunities, however, to talk to the medical doctors that received the dead specimens.
In addition to this one, there might have been two, and because one was picked up by a policeman who 2 weeks later actually died, even though he was in his late 20s, of unusual circumstances.
Be called a subspecies form or subcategory of an experimental being that did not have, as it were, the higher mental capacity to make all of the maneuvers to escape, as it were, the physical capture. The being was taken to a hospital facility called as Humanitas, where he expired, and then put on a special military convoy that was brought to the city of Campinas and taken to a military facility that was under the ground used by the police of the previous administration for the torturing of political adversaries, where the body was examined. At that time, I was doing research in computer science in Campinas at the University of Unicamp, and had the opportunity with colleagues to bring back information that was then presented at the United Nations in a private hearing in November of 1996. This signals something that is even more important, in my opinion, than Roswell, because it is showing that there was experimentation taking place. Exobiological forces from another plane of existence are coming into the human community for experimental subjects.
Right, we talked about the keys of Enoch. Here's a quote from the keys. Vehicle squadrons.
Key 309. Stationed over important cities of the world will be seen, motivating humanity to seek spiritual answers to life. We will see this reflected in the following film we have from Lima, Peru. The small flotilla of spaceships that appeared over Lima are also appearing over other cities of the world. Again, this is very important for you to realize in our report. This is not going to be an easy transition.
But let's see what they...
Eran aproximadamente la 1:40 de la tarde, cuando de pronto el cielo de la capital lució de esta manera. Extraños puntos luminosos aparecieron a una altura de unos 2.000 metros, formando figuras geométricas. Primero un triángulo, y luego, ante la atónita mirada de los transeúntes, los objetos luminosos comenzaron a moverse y a multiplicarse, hasta quedar perfectamente alineados. Segundos después, se alejaron de dos en dos. Fueron 7 las esferas que lograron verse en el centro de Lima, en lugares como el de la Avenida España. El cielo despejado permitió que los objetos fueran...
So what was really interesting was the fact of the triangle coordinate, that even though they were seeing something like 8 or 9 vehicles, the predominant arrangement was flying in a particular pattern or formation.
There's a pyramid in everything. So we're seeing multidimensional pyramids. So let's come now to an overview. What does this mean in terms of ETI, extraterrestrial, intelligence, genetic material? Though it appears that humans may have been influenced by ET intelligence, we have a higher blueprint. In other words, you can look at the Australopithecus, you can look at what the Leakeys did in Ethiopia, so looking at the earlier elephants of life some 3.1 million years ago. But you can also look at the insectoids, the reptilian types, the gray specimens, which some would call the artificial forms of intelligence that are now peering at us from all directions, wondering what is going to happen to the human race with a big question mark. We see in the next exhibit from the Keys of Enoch this remarkable grid. And Desiree, explain why is this so important?
Right. Well, the whole DNA structure that we are a part of, we're going to show you, we believe is part of a higher programming function. Peter Gurayev in Russia has said that the DNA itself is like a light wavelength. And so if we came from a higher vibratory code structure, then that light code structure would concretize into the physical manifestation. We see the DNA nebula.
Gurayev was attracted to the Keys of Enoch because of the protein triple code structure and also the what we call the holographic nature of our DNA and how it could be repackaged and sent into space.
Right. So recently, and this really just came out April 1st, is an alien message embedded in our genetic code. And this is from 2 Russian scientists from Kazakhstan who actually have done the research and said that our DNA is so perfect, that it didn't evolve from this side. The complication is amazing. The storage capacity and the maintenance, even though we know there's mutations, but the maintenance of function is something that really could not have evolved over a 4 million year or a 4 billion year cycle even. They believe, this is their article, it's called The Wow Signal of the Terrestrial Genetic Code, and their names are Vladimir Sherbik and Maxima Mukukov. And they are from the Republic of Kazakhstan. I'm just going to show you, this is some of their pictures that they have in their report. It's a scientific report, but it shows they've analyzed the complete complexity of the DNA structure and the connection, of course, as we were saying, with the whole triplet code, which is part of our genetic function.
The keys of Enoch basically were the first statement of the God code, and represent work that the Russians and Germans are now working on behind the scenes. And so we invite those of you who have an engineering background or science background to work with us, because this is the importance of recognizing that we have friends in space who respect us, do not violate our free will, do not take our precious bodily fluids for their sexual experiments, do not subordinate us to all of these outrageous situations going on. Indeed, there is a war or dialectic being played out in the other dimensional worlds to see if we can survive the test. And the test is, do not make UFOs into a golden calf, but to find your own Christ-like or higher nature that is part of the blueprint of life.
Right, and so this is actually from NASA on this side of the screen, it's from Kazakhstan on the other, and what they came out with last year, which we did several reports on, is a meteorite found also in Antarctica, not only had amino acids, which are the basic building blocks of life, but they actually have what they call nucleobases. This is really the basis that makes up our DNA. So when you see these ATG, they found the G and the C, which is purines, basically inside the meteorite, right inside. And they did the study, and they said these came from space, not from Earth. So that's what's so important. So basically the whole structure of everything that we are a part of, the amino acids, the nucleobases, all has been found inside meteorites that came from space.
So this is the much bigger story than looking for fossils on Mars, because the basic building blocks are all throughout the local universe, wherever we look with our telescopes.
And there's other forms of intelligence. You know, of course, we only think about us as being the superior life form, but if you go back some thousands of years ago, you had these Homo florensius, we're Homo sapiens, these were Homo florensius. They were 1 meter tall. 1 meter sounds familiar to some of you studying extraterrestrials. They were hobbits found in an area called the Isle of Flores, which is that's from our book, and Dr. Hurtak pinpointed 12 key areas around the world, and one of them, right there, 121 degrees, 27 minutes, goes right through the Isle of Flores. Now, he wrote this book in the 70s. This discovery only came out in the 90s.
Late 90s.
Late 90s. In addition to that, the same area is around Taiwan, is what we call the area of Yonaguni. And we have a video downstairs that talks about the fact of previous civilizations existing in that area. I don't want to get too... Yeah, go ahead.
We go too fast, is the keys of Enoch you should have, because it gives us the map of the world with these 12 contact areas of previous civilizations, and exactly in these areas, Russian scientists, Japanese scientists, Brazilian scientists have found the evidences of an earlier evolutionary period of time that is important, that throws light onto the fact that we have always had other intelligence with us from a higher evolutionary viewpoint, not only 18,000 years ago, but going back 180,000 years.
And even on this planet, we had the Neanderthals, which were separate from Homo sapiens, technically, and us and Homo flores. So we had 3 hominid life forms on this planet alone. Think of if we had 3 here, how many are out there in space? We claim there's at least 70, if not more, extraterrestrial races.
We have also in Bolivia this interesting figure in the gate of Colasasaya. One interesting figure, it is believed that this is Viracocha, or the symbol of Viracocha, who created the earth twice. At first he made a land of giants who were cruel and evil. He created a flood to destroy them.
Now, one could say that that came from our story, that they made it up, but if you really go back, you realize they had the same legends. So they didn't copy ours, but there were giants on the earth, there was a flood, there was a change. So our Bible, Viracocha, which is in the area of Peru and Bolivia, had the same history. When you go back, the same history. He also was able to walk on water, and then he made us out of clay. This is their cosmology.
Because they're like keys. If you look at them very carefully, there are other interesting geometries here, too numerous to go into. Second, he made humans out of clay and gave them different symbols, such as clothes and languages. Now, we have a colleague here at this conference, Fred Rusher, who is a master in sacred geometries. So after we're through, take time to look at the sacred geometries that he's put together based on the keys of Enoch. This will open a whole new portal for understanding why these pyramidal zones throughout the world are not simply pyramids, but they are a collection for all of the platonic solids and all of the other higher dimensional geometries necessary in, as it were, the ladder of life.
So another quote from the Keys of Enoch: the Atlanteans also possessed the ability to create subspecies intelligence to govern the nature of the material world. We're also told, as the key goes on, that some of the manipulation of the genetic code was not well done. So this interbreeding gave rise to a diminishing spiritual capacity and produced a nation of strong physicals who are muscular and emotionally aggressive. So that ties into some of the legends of the giants.
So beware of the Anunnaki and those civilizations that like to enslave people to technology. We're going into another situation of Big Brother and robotized society dismissing the element of the human being. And so this is a struggle that must be carried on to maintain our purpose of life and not have it degraded into experiments, as we see here, where a human ear is being grown on the back of a mouse. We're for future science, but also science that respects ethics and humans.
And manipulating the genetic code actually, if you understand our cosmology, will actually break the connection link that we have to the original code structure. So this is a part of the key, and that's why we feel that even the flood took place in the past. They were manipulating the code structures on this planet. We don't think that we are a hybrid race. There maybe are hybrid races. You saw Vargina, that was a hybrid more likely, but we're not hybrid. We're actually coming from a higher code structure, a light code structure down here. So manipulating the code structure will break that connection. That's why Jesus was able to ascend into higher worlds. I'm going to go a little bit quick. I'll probably skip that one section.
I want to say that this is so important in genetic engineering and stem cell research. Your father was working with Chris Barnard in South Africa, who did the first heart transplant. We're all for positive, constructive uses. But when you go into different species realms too quickly without the proper information base, then you will destroy, as it were, the whole genetic process that's so valuable for our Adamic reality and identity.
Right, maybe we can just go 5 minutes over because I know we started a little early, started a little late. I'm sorry. So we are existing. You see our sun's location in the Orion arm of our Milky Way, and we know that now. Did the ancients know that? How could the ancients know that? If you go back to the evidence of the Mayan culture, you find the maize god was born from the turtle shell. Who was the maize god? He was connected with Orion. Of course, you see this also. This is one of the ancient glyphs. You have the turtle shell, and that represented is, if you expand these stars out, you see the belt of Orion, you see Anal, Lam, Safe, and Rigel. They considered that their home, their threshold, their main source of manifestation. Similar to what we find in the Great Pyramid, with Orion connected with Osiris. One of the star shafts goes to Orion, another goes to Sirius on one side, and Alpha Draconis, Ursa Minor on the other. We believe that shows the cosmology of the heavens, that you have very positive intelligences connected with the gods, capital G, on Orion and Sirius, and you have lesser forces connected with the Draco culture on the other side.
In biblical language, we would call them B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, or the Most High. What we're seeing here is a very simplified illustration of showing the forces of light in the universe. Positive syntropy towards Orion, negative entropy or the downward spiral to those who would, in the sense of the draconic or the negative spiral, take us into a lower realm of creation.
Right, and this is all part of the Keys of Enoch cosmology, but that's come out now also in the Mayan. Let's look at these possibilities. We're working on a book of image and similitude, we call it, reptilian beings. I believe that they actually were in possession of this earth in the time of the dinosaur era. And they actually do have a different genetic code structure. That's very important to realize, that their code structure, I remember Babylon 5, if you ever remember that, if anyone who's a buff on that, they were talking with the reptilian guy and said, I remember when you said we were part of you, and then we found out we weren't.
These illustrations are from shamans and social scientists we talked to in Brazil, in Central America, as well as Africa. These are not, shall we say, rough sketches, but detailed sketches, also showing the so-called mantis type, the intelligence behind many of these so-called gray intelligences. I talked even recently to a movie producer who said he had seen a mantis-type entity guiding his life. And so there are pros and cons on both sides. We have to be very cautious of the subject and also the spirituality that comes out of the contact story. It is not simply the external, but also the internal feeling that you have from your heart, as well as the energy from your eye into their eye that determines the consistency of their report and the higher knowledge they wish to share, if that is truly of the light.
Another common connection is people who have seen beings with animal faces, or in this case, this is a dog-faced, perhaps connected with Canis Minor, because that's where some of the contactees believe their connection is coming from. These are all different types of beings and we are one of them. We are one form of intelligence in the vast universe.
We have a higher origin, according to the Keys of Enoch. We come from a much higher design that was brought into creation to, as it were, rebalance other evolutionary experiments that did not work out. The Zeta Reticules also represent an area of greater interest from the area of reticulum, as well as from the area of Ursa Major. We see one of the manifestations, according to our South African correspondence.
And of course, this is similar to what the Benny and Benny Hill found in New Hampshire in 1961. They claim their gray beings came from the area of Zeta Reticula. So when you do the research, you realize that there are many forms of intelligence out there. One more quote from the Keys. Many of the space brotherhoods who have used technologies of death are being removed from the center of the galaxy and set back several evolutionary dimensions. This is why there are grotesque intelligences, or what we would consider grotesque, now occupying the atmosphere of planets like our own, for they have been recycled to the edge of space so as to be humbled in the painful path of evolutionary renewal. But these grotesque forms only constitute a portion of those created. So we want to put the fact that we are an Adamic species. Some people call it the Nordics.
This includes all categories of the human race, and particularly those developing nations and cultures that have, as it were, temples and pyramids connected with Arcturus, the Pleiades, Orion, these major stargate areas for the coming of what is called, in mythological language, the brotherhoods, the angelic forces, the higher hierarchies.
And of course, there is a blue race, and of course, this is from the movie Avatar, but technically you have Krishna in the Hindu cosmology, and some evidence of the fact that a blue race also exists in outer space, maybe even more advanced than what was portrayed in Avatar, but we wanted to throw that out, that there is.
Technology was developed by Vince Pace, who worked with us in one of the underwater explorations off Japan. And he and James Cameron have revolutionized the world of cinema by this great opportunity to make the human mind fly in space or feel higher dimensional reality. And so we come into the conclusion of where we are in terms of the genetic track. We are being prepared for what I call the experience of the outshining of the light within us. And when we can balance the energy vehicle, our mental, our higher vibratory vehicle of spirit and soul coming together, we create what is called the Gematrian body of light within. It allows us to eventually work with the light from above, the greater superluminal light, as we see here depicted in the Vitruvian Man from Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others, give us the ability to reach outwards with this great crown of glory.
Right, and so really this is our essence, which is the light body essence, and I think that's what's really important, that there are light beings in addition to all the extraterrestrial beings down there. We were in Mexico for December 21st, 2012, but we also set up a conference for December 22nd and 23rd because we knew that there was more to go. The planet would never come to an end that quickly because there are so many beings of extraterrestrial and ultra-terrestrial origin that are working and managing this planet.
So what does this picture tell us, Desiree?
Right. This is the cosmology of the keys of Enoch. It says that there is really a greater, higher level of intelligence, and there are various hierarchies connected with the office of the Christ, connected with Michael, connected with the councils of light. And when you come down into this reality, you take these code structures into a 64 sacred letter grid that's connected with planetary realms. So there's a hierarchical evolutionary phase.
In Tulum, Mexico, in the year 2000, while I was teaching from the keys and using sacred mantras or expressions of the divine name, a light manifested around my body momentarily. My translator was taken by surprise in the back. You can see this is just one illustration of putting on the garments of light, the exchanging of the garments of light that John the Divine speaks of. If you read very carefully the literature behind the scenes of the traditional cultures of the Far East and the Near East, there is a light body or diamond-like vehicle that we can enter with proper understanding of human service. And as we enter into this divine-human partnership, we realize that there are many stages of growth. As we see here in the book on the 72 divine names, we go into higher ascending structures of service, realizing that we are the living capstone, we are the temple of understanding, we are the sacred geometry that brings all of the temples in sacred geometries of life into balance. And so, to conclude, and the ones having insight will shine like the brightness of the expanse, and those who are bringing the many to righteousness like the stars to time infinite, even forever. And as for you, O Daniel, make secret the words and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will rove about, and the true knowledge will become abundant. Knowledge will speed up according to the prophecy of Daniel, and I believe this is the time. Knowledge will speed up. Wisdom will be poured out upon us. These greater events of the cosmic family will show themselves, and the great test of the human race waking up to become cosmic citizens will be taken within our hearts. May we be blessed in this great imperative of reclaiming our destiny in space, our citizenship in what the ancients called the house of many mansions. May we be blessed and glorified in the Father's name of names.
We thank you for joining us. We have great speakers today.
We thank you